Usually, when you want to get out of a massive crushing obligation, there's like a paper trail.
Right,
Okay?
absolutely. Yeah, there's always a legal mechanism.
Right. You hire a lawyer, you find some obscure loophole in a contract, or, I don't know, you declare bankruptcy to shield your assets.
Or, if things are truly desperate, you pack a bag in the middle of the night, cross a border, and just completely change your jurisdiction.
Exactly. You just step outside the boundaries of the system that's holding you accountable. It's a geographical evasion.
Yeah, a legal evasion. The human mind is incredibly brilliant at finding the edge of the map and simply stepping off it.
And human beings, historically, have spent thousands of years convinced they've found the ultimate, undeniable edge of the map.
The ultimate loophole.
Right, the foolproof escape hatch to default on the debt of their own actions. The great eraser, which is, well, biological death. The idea that the exact moment the heart monitor flatlines, the ledger is just wiped clean. Game over.
You unplug the machine and whatever you did,
Good, bad. Totally catastrophic.
it simply ceases to matter because the physical entity that committed those actions ceases to exist.
It's the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card, philosophically speaking.
It really is. And what's so striking about this assumption is just how universal it is,
Yeah.
Regardless of the era, the culture, or even the technological advancement of the society.
Yeah, I mean, the ancient warlord and the modern corporate embezzler actually share the exact same underlying premise.
Right, which is basically, if I can just outrun the consequences until my biological clock runs out, I win.
But, and this is where we're going today, what if that ultimate escape hatch is a complete myth?
A total illusion.
Exactly. What if we have fundamentally misunderstood the very architecture of reality? What if biological death isn't a deletion of your file, but just the moment your file gets locked and uploaded for processing?
That is the core question.
So today we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating conceptual framework, one that treats human existence not as some fleeting biological accident, but as an incredibly rigorous, unhackable operating system.
Yeah, and we're grounding this in a 1979 masterclass by the sociologist and systems thinker Ghulam Ahmed Parwez.
Right, and he took a foundational text on civilizational design, specifically Surah As-Sajdah, verses 10 through 13 of the Quran.
And he analyzed it not through the lens of dogma, right,
Uh-huh.
or sentimentality, but literally like a master engineer looking at the source code of human behavior.
I think that's super important to establish up front. If you are listening to this expecting a traditional, I don't know, soothing sermon about the afterlife,
You're in the wrong place.
yeah, you will need to pivot your expectations entirely, because Parwez trips away all those centuries of mythology, the superstition, the spooky imagery.
He reveals this highly sophisticated blueprint of what we can call the consequence cycle.
The consequence cycle. I love that term.
Right. He maps out the systemic rules regarding human action, the actual mechanics of biological termination, and then the structural reckoning that inevitably follows.
So we're going to explore how this framework systematically dismantles the illusion that the end of biological life means the end of consequence. Let's look at the foundational argument humans make to justify this escape hatch.
The bones to dust argument.
Exactly. We find this captured perfectly in the 10th verse of the text, which quotes this ancient but honestly recurring psychological strategy. It says, they say, "When we have been lost in the earth, shall we indeed be in a new creation."
Now, that verse is crucial because it isn't just recording a moment of biological skepticism,
Like someone just wondering how biology works.
Right. It's not just an ancient group of people looking at a decaying body and asking an innocent biological question about how cells could possibly reassemble. Parwez frames this as the ultimate legal defense mechanism of the human ego.
The logic is entirely utilitarian.
Exactly. It basically states, when I die, my physical matter disperses into the soil. My bones become dust.
Therefore, the physical entity that committed the actions no longer exists.
And if the actor is gone, the accountability is gone. It's the equation of physical dissolution equals moral deletion.
Okay, I want to push back on that for a second, or at least put myself in the shoes of someone making that argument. Because let's be real, if you look at it purely empirically, it makes perfect sense.
In a strictly physical universe, sure.
Right. Because if you smash a physical machine to pieces, it stops running its program. If I take a hammer to my laptop right now, the software stops executing.
Naturally.
So why wouldn't the human mind, which is tied to the physical brain, simply cease processing its moral debt? when the brain decomposes.
Well, that is the exact trap of confusing the hardware with the user.
Confusing the hardware with the user. Okay, break that down.
The counter-argument the text presents, which Parwez really highlights, operates on a completely different understanding of data processing. The text asserts that the consequence system is not limited to the duration of one physical body's existence.
So the system is bigger than the biology.
Much bigger. The inputs, your decisions, your actions, the intentionality behind them are registered in a system that supersedes the physical hardware. The biological shutdown doesn't stop the broader software from running.
It merely removes your access to the terminal.
Exactly. Parwez uses a beautifully grounded analogy to explain this separation between the physical vehicle and the actual human self. He introduces the concept of the crude.
The crude.
Yeah, which we can translate as the human personality or the true self, and he separates it entirely from the physical body.
How does he define this crude practically? Because, human personality can sound a bit abstract. Are we talking about, like, my sense of humor, my memories, my conscious awareness?
It's deeper than that. Think of the crude not as your biological memory or your genetic quirks, but as the cumulative integration of your choices and your values.
Oh, okay.
It's the core organizing center of your consciousness that observes, decides, and critically carries the weight of those decisions.
So the body is just what, a vessel?
Parwez argues that the physical body is merely the temporary medium for this crude to interact with the physical world. To make this concrete, he uses the analogy of a train ticket.
Okay, a train ticket. Walk me through how that maps onto biological life.
So imagine you buy a ticket to take a journey. That ticket is absolutely necessary to get on the train, to exist in that specific space, and to interact with that specific environment for the duration of the trip.
Right, you can't be a passenger without.
Exactly. You cannot participate in the journey without it. But once the journey reaches its final destination, what happens to the ticket?
You hand it over to the ticket collector.
Right. The ticket is punched, it's discarded, it's entirely dissolved from its functional purpose, it's gone.
But the passenger doesn't dissolve.
The passenger steps off the train and continues onward into an entirely new environment.
Wow.
The fundamental mistake humanity has made for thousands of years is confusing the passenger with the ticket. When the ticket is taken away, which is the event we call biological death, we assume the passenger has ceased to exist.
Because we only ever saw them holding the ticket.
Exactly. But the entire system, the entire architecture of consequence is designed around the passenger, not the piece of paper they use to ride the train.
Okay, so if the passenger steps off the train, the environment they are stepping into must be governed by entirely different rules than the interior of the train car.
Yes, absolutely.
Because the physics of the platform are not the physics of the moving carriage. And this is where the source material gets staggering in its precision.
It really does.
Because if we are treating this text like an operating manual, the terminology used to describe that transition should be highly specific. And according to Parwez's analysis of the linguistics, it absolutely is.
The linguistic engineering here is phenomenal. So Parwez cross-references another part of the text, Surah 29, verse 64, to explain the profound structural difference between the physical journey and what comes next.
Okay, lay it out for us.
He focuses on two Arabic words used to describe life, hayat and hayawan. Both of these words share the exact same root letters.
So they're linguistically related.
Fundamentally, yes. They both relate to the concept of life, vitality, and the manifestation of movement. But in classical Arabic, there's an intricate mathematical concept called wazan.
Wazan, which means what exactly?
It translates to structural weight or pattern. The structural form a word takes completely alters its functional implication within a system.
It's sort of similar to how we use prefixes and suffixes in English to change the entire operational state of a word, right? Like the difference between saying, I am coding and I am a coder.
That's a perfect parallel.
The root is the same, but one is a temporary action and the other is a permanent state of identity. The systemic implications are completely different.
Exactly. So to describe the present physical life, the life of the train ride, the biological ticket, the text uses the phrase hayat dunya. The word hayat sits on a standard normal structural weight.
Meaning?
It implies progressive evolution. It describes a life governed by standard physical and biological laws. It moves step by step, logically, predictably.
Okay, so it represents the biological evolution we map in textbooks, where one incremental link in the chain predictably leads to the next.
Yes, normal, everyday physics. Gravity pulls things down, cells divide through mitosis, metabolism burns calories to create energy. It's a closed, observable loop of cause and effect.
So that's Hayat, the ticket. What about the other word?
Right. To describe the future state of existence, the life of the passenger after they have handed over the ticket, the text uses the word hayawan. This word sits on the falan structural weight.
And what does that structural weight imply?
The defining characteristic of the falan weight in Arabic morphology is that it denotes something sudden, eruptive, and entirely breaking from the previous chain of causation.
Wait, so it's explicitly stating that the next phase is not just an invisible continuation of the same biological rule.
Exactly. It is not just life, but in the clouds. In modern scientific terminology, the word hayawan on this specific grammatical weight denotes emergent evolution. This is a concept where a sudden, extraordinary leap occurs that cannot be predicted or entirely explained merely by analyzing the previous progressive steps.
It shatters the previous physical chains.
Completely shatters them.
I think we need to define emergent evolution for the listener because it's a really crucial concept here.
Go for it.
So, if I understand it correctly, progressive evolution is a staircase. You can see every single step. Emergent evolution is when you combine two things and get a property that didn't exist in either of the original components.
Right.
The classic example is water. You take hydrogen, which is a highly combustible gas. You take oxygen, which is a gas that fuels combustion. You put it together, and suddenly you have a liquid that puts out fires.
Right. Wetness is an emergent property.
Exactly. You could study hydrogen and oxygen individually for 1,000,000 years, and you would never, ever predict wetness.
That is the perfect illustration of an emergent leap. And Parwez points out how this exact linguistic distinction between the progressive Hayat and the emergent Hayawan astounded Maurice Bucaille,
Who was he?
a famous French physician and author who deeply analyzed this text back in the late 20th century. Bucaille recognized that modern science cleanly separates progressive evolution, which is slow and steady, from emergent evolution, which represents a radical phase shift into new operational properties.
And here's a text from the 7th century, utilizing a highly specific grammatical weight to differentiate the two.
Exactly, differentiating the biological, predictable life of the physical body from the emergent, non-biological life of the human personality.
This circles back perfectly to the laptop analogy we touched on earlier.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine a malicious user who has just executed a massive cyber attack from their laptop. The authorities are closing in. In a panic, the user takes a sledgehammer and completely pulverizes the physical machine.
The screen is shattered, the motherboard is dust.
The hard drive is physically annihilated. And the user sits back, wipes the sweat from their brow, and thinks, I am safe. The physical machine that committed the crime no longer exists.
The user is applying the exact logic of verse 10. I am lost in the earth, my bones are dust, the accountability is gone.
But the user doesn't understand network architecture. They don't understand that while they were typing, the laptop was actively syncing to a decentralized cloud. The physical hardware is broken, absolutely. The local drive is gone. But the data, the inputs, the keystrokes, the malicious code was already uploaded. You cannot smash a local hard drive to escape a decentralized network.
That is brilliantly put.
The physical dissolution of the body has absolutely zero impact on the data that has already been registered in the universal cloud of consequence.
The physical dissolution, the shattering of the laptop, the handing over of the ticket is merely the termination of local access.
Right.
Which raises a vital question about the actual process of that termination. If the hardware shutting down isn't erasing the data, what exactly is happening during the process of death within this system? We need to move from the superstitious view of death to the systemic mechanics of termination.
Which brings us to verse 11. It states, say, the angel of death who has been entrusted with you will take you fully. Then to your Lord you will be returned.
Right.
Now, I have to stop here. The moment you introduce the phrase angel of death, you lose the systems engineering crowd.
Oh, instantly.
It immediately conjures up a very specific mythological image. People picture a grim reaper with a scythe or, a literal winged entity descending from the sky to physically pull a glowing soul out of a person's chest. It sounds like folklore.
Parwez was acutely aware of that barrier, and he is ruthless in his methodology of stripping away that mythological imagery.
Thank goodness.
He insists that if we are reading this as a blueprint for productive order, we cannot rely on localized anthropomorphic ghost stories. He explains that the Arabic phrase malakul maut, which is universally translated as angel of death, should not be understood as a literal, sentient, winged assassin.
Well, if it isn't an assassin in a black cloak, what is the systemic function of Malak ul-Maut?
To understand that, you have to look at the root word malak. In the Quranic lexicon, malaika fundamentally relates to forces, laws, or operational agents within a system.
Oh, interesting. So like physics.
Exactly. Gravity is a malak. Electromagnetism is a malak. Therefore, the angel of death is the inexorable wearing down of physical forces.
It's entropy.
Yes. It is biological entropy. It is the gradual degradation of your telomeres. It is the cumulative buildup of cellular damage over decades. It's the inevitable, mathematically certain crash of the biological hardware.
So it's a built-in feature.
Parwez argues it is not an external entity that suddenly jumps out of the shadows to snatch you. It is a programmed force of obsolescence that rides with you from the moment of your birth, slowly pulling the energy out of the physical system until that system can no longer sustain operations.
Let me make sure I am grasping the scale of this. You're saying the angel of death is entropy programmed into the physical vehicle. It is the battery degrading over thousands of charge cycles until it simply cannot hold a charge anymore.
That's precisely it. The system has built-in limits for the physical interface. But look at the second half of that verse. After the biological entropy takes the physical system fully offline, the text says, "Then to your Lord you will be returned."
Okay, let's look at that.
The Arabic word used there is turjan.
Let's frame turjon socio-economically or systemically. If we're rejecting the imagery of flying up into the sky to sit on a golden cloud, what does returned actually mean in the context of an operating system?
Returned means the actor's file their unalterable record of choices, intentions, and inputs re-enters the primary operating system's consequence processing queue.
Oh, wow.
Think of your physical life as a period of active data generation. You are a localized node on the network, constantly generating new inputs. When the node goes offline due to biological entropy, the data doesn't evaporate. Turjan is the synchronization back to the central processor.
So the processing happens independently of the biological state of the user. The system does not need you breathing to calculate the compounding interest of your actions.
Exactly. And this introduces the most critical distinction in Parwez's entire framework. To explain how these inputs are recorded completely independently of your physical biology, he uses an analogy that is brilliantly grounded.
What's the analogy?
He uses the analogy of ghee.
Clarified butter. I want to spend significant time unpacking this ghee analogy because this is where the difference between physics and values and how the system tracks them becomes crystal clear.
Yeah, it's a game changer. Parwez asks his audience to run a mental experiment. Imagine 2 jars of pure, incredibly high-quality ghee.
Okay, 2 jars.
Physically, chemically, under a microscope, they are absolutely identical. They share the same caloric density, the same fat profile, the same nutritional value. There is no biological test that can distinguish between them.
Right.
But there is a hidden variable in their origin. Jar A was purchased with money you earned honestly through hard work and equitable exchange. Jar B was purchased with money you stole, extorted, or embezzled from someone else.
So we have honestly earned ghee and stolen ghee.
Now, let's analyze this strictly through the lens of physical laws. If you consume the stolen ghee, does your digestive system care about the origin of the funds?
Absolutely not. Biology is agnostic to morality. If I eat stolen ghee, my stomach acid breaks down exactly the same way. My intestines absorb the nutrients. My body extracts the exact same amount of energy, the same calories. From a purely biological standpoint, the stolen jar nourishes my physical body just as effectively as the honest jar. Physics doesn't do background checks.
Right.
And I want to lean into this because if I'm playing devil's advocate, this seems like a massive flaw in the system. Let's modernize the analogy.
Okay, go for it.
Imagine a corrupt executive. He orchestrates a massive fraud, ruins thousands of pensions, and walks away with $50 million. He uses that stolen money to buy the best organic food, the best medical care, personal trainers, a stress-free environment.
The ultimate setup.
Right. Biologically, because of his theft, he thrives. He lives to be 95 in perfect health. In the physical realm, the bad actor wins, the thief gets stronger. How does Parwez justify a consequence system where bad inputs are physically rewarded?
That tension you are highlighting is exactly why Parwez's distinction is so vital. If the universe only operated on physical laws, you would be entirely correct. The thief wins.
But it doesn't.
Right. The core argument of this systems approach is that the human operating system does not run solely on physical laws. It runs parallel to them on a ledger called Aqdar,
Akar.
which translates to permanent universal values. While the physical body metabolizes the stolen ghee perfectly, the human personality, the kudi, the passenger we talked about earlier, metabolizes the value of the action.
So there are two metabolisms running simultaneously. The biological stomach digests the calories, but the kudi digests the ethics of the transaction.
Spot on. The stolen ghee nourishes the biological ticket, but the act of theft actively degrades, weakens, and disintegrates the human personality. The input of extortion or theft is recorded on a completely different hard drive than the physical calories.
Believable.
Conversely, the honest ghee nourishes both the physical body and the human self. The executive who stole millions might have a pristine biological vessel, but his kudi, the only part of him that survives the transition of emergent evolution, is starved, corrupted, and structurally compromised.
Let me synthesize this, because the implications are chilling if you really internalize it.
Yeah, they are.
If the system processes value inputs completely independently of biological metabolism, then biological death is really just a data entry deadline.
Yes.
It is simply the cutoff point. The system locks your file. You cannot add any new inputs. You cannot apologize. You cannot return the stolen money. You cannot alter the data.
The file is locked tight.
But the processing of those values, the compounding structural degradation caused by a lifetime of stolen ghee, continues without you.
Exactly. The biological entity is merely a temporary interface designed to register values. The values themselves are the actual lasting currency of the universal system.
Which naturally forces us to ask, what happens when the processing finishes?
Mm.
Once that file is locked and the system runs the calculations on all those hidden values, what does the final output actually look like?
The final result.
Right. If my kudi's been secretly degrading for decades while my physical body looked perfectly healthy, what happens when the final bill arrives?
Well, this brings us to the concept of the engine of reason and the structural reckoning. We look at verse 12.
Which says, if only you could see when the criminals hang their heads before their Lord.
And once again, the traditional translation immediately paints a highly localized theatrical picture in our minds.
Hanging their heads before their Lord. Yeah, most people instantly visualize a cosmic courtroom.
Right, they picture marble columns in the clouds.
A giant judge's bench, a booming voice reading off a list of sins, and a group of people in shackles looking down at their feet, feeling an overwhelming sense of emotional guilt.
I think we've all been conditioned by media and folklore to view accountability as a judicial trial, but Parwez rejects that completely, right?
He violently rejects it.
He argues that this anthropomorphic courtroom scene completely diminishes the scale and the rigorous mechanism of the text. This verse is not describing an emotional feeling of guilt in front of a judge. Guilt is an emotion.
So what is it?
What the text is describing is a mathematically inevitable event. It is a description of a structural reckoning.
I love that phrase, structural reckoning. Let's break that down. What does a structural reckoning actually look like in practice outside of a courtroom?
It's the precise, undeniable moment when the consequences of a misaligned life, and this applies whether we're talking about a single individual's life or the collective civilizational trajectory of an entire society, become physically and mathematically undeniable.
Okay.
The hanging of heads isn't about the emotion of shame. It is the physical posture of a system that has finally received the full, devastating feedback of its own misaligned inputs. It is the posture of collapse.
I see the distinction. It's not a teenager looking down at the floor because they got caught stealing a cookie by an authority figure. It's an architectural failure.
Exactly.
Think about an arrogant engineering firm. They are commissioned to build a massive multi-billion-dollar suspension bridge over a major river. But the executives are greedy. They cut corners.
They usually do.
Right. They use faulty mathematical models. They buy substandard steel. They ignore the stress test warnings from the junior engineers. For 5 years, the bridge stands tall. It looks magnificent. Traffic flows over it.
The executives are winning awards.
They're eating the stolen ghee, feeling physically strong and culturally validated.
They believe they have outsmarted the physics of tension and load-bearing because the consequence hasn't manifested instantly.
Precisely. But the physics are just compounding. The microfractures in the substandard steel are growing. Then, one day, the wind hits a very specific resonant frequency, the traffic load reaches maximum capacity, and the entire bridge violently snaps and collapses into the river in a matter of seconds.
Total structural failure.
The hanging of heads described in the verse isn't the executives feeling bad in a courtroom. It is the executives standing on the riverbank, staring in horrified silence at the twisted rubble of their creation. It is the undeniable physical proof of their miscalculation. The math finally caught up with the physics. You cannot argue with the collapsed bridge. You cannot hire a lawyer to debate the river. The hanging of heads is the realization that the system's rules were immutable all along.
That analogy perfectly captures the text's concept of the arrow of time, which is a major focus for Parwez. In the continuation of that verse, after the collapse happens, these misaligned actors beg the system. They say, "Send us back. We have seen the truth. Now we will do good work."
They want to hit the undo button. Let us rewind the simulation. Let us go back and redraw the blueprints now that we actually believe the bridge will fall.
But the system categorically, mathematically rejects this request, and it rejects it not out of cruelty, but out of structural integrity.
Because you can't uncollapse a bridge.
The consequence cycle does not run backward. The arrow of time is unidirectional. The entire purpose of the system is to test the capacity for alignment before the structural collapse occurs. True alignment, true intellectual engagement requires using your given faculties, your intellect, your observation, your reason to read the data and make the correct structural choices while the bridge is still in the construction phase.
Because if you only believe the math is faulty after the bridge collapses on your head, you aren't demonstrating engineering prowess or moral alignment. You're just observing a disaster.
Precisely.
Staring at a fire doesn't make you a fire marshal. It just means you have eyes.
Parwez makes a profound psychological point here regarding the nature of human belief. He argues that forced belief, achieved by staring at terrifying consequences, staring at the literal flames of a collapsed system, is not faith. It is not alignment. It is simply biological panic.
Just a reflex.
If a system terrorizes you into compliance by showing you the agonizing punishment beforehand, you are not developing a complex, healthy human personality. You are not developing your cootie. You are just functioning like a rat in a laboratory maze, desperately avoiding an electric shock.
The system demands that you deduce the consequence through reason, not experience it through forced terror.
Exactly.
The system respects human intellect enough to say, here is the data, here are the historical precedents of collapsed civilizations, do the math. It refuses to hold your hand and show you the fire, because doing so would destroy your agency.
And to illustrate how necessary this forward momentum is and why the system cannot just pause or rewind to let people fix their mistakes infinitely, Parwez weaves in a breathtaking poetic analogy from the philosopher Allama Iqbal.
Oh, I love this one.
He compares the process of physical death, the termination of the biological interface, to a blossom falling from a branch.
Let's explore that blossom metaphor because it completely reframes how we view the end of life.
So, when a fruit-bearing tree blooms in the spring, the blossoms are stunning. They are fragrant, delicate, and they represent a necessary, vital stage of the tree's life cycle. But eventually, inevitably, the blossom must wither, detach from the branch, and fall to the ground.
It's unavoidable.
Iqbal says the branch should never weep for the fallen blossom. Why? Because the blossom must fall for the fruit to emerge. The physical life, the biological existence, is just the blossom. It is the preface of a much larger book.
And no sane person stops reading a book after the preface.
Right.
If you mourn the end of the preface so deeply that you refuse to turn the page, you never get to experience the actual narrative. The fall of the blossom isn't a failure of the tree's operating system. It is the exact mechanism required for yielding fruit.
Exactly.
Death isn't a glitch in the software. It's the programmed transition to the harvest.
If you cling exclusively to the physical life, if you obsess over keeping the train ticket forever and never stepping onto the platform, or artificially preserving the blossom and preventing the fruit from growing, you are fundamentally misunderstanding the design architecture of the universe.
You're stuck in the preface.
The physical life is a prerequisite, but it is not the ultimate destination of the cootie.
Which naturally leads us to the biggest complaint, the most persistent argument raised by every user who has ever crashed a system.
The ultimate grievance.
The ultimate philosophical grievance. It brings us to the law of requital, or what Parwez terms mukafat yamal. The grievance is this: if the system leads to such devastating, irreversible collapses for bad inputs, if the bridge falls and destroys everything because of bad math, why allow bad inputs in the first place?
It's a fair question.
If the designer is so capable, why wasn't the system built to only accept perfect data? Why is there an option to fail so catastrophically?
This brings us to verse 13, which is, without exaggeration, one of the most misunderstood and violently mistranslated verses in the entire text.
Let's hear it.
The verse states, "If we had willed, we could have given every soul its guidance, but the word for me has come into effect. I will surely fill hell with jinn and people altogether."
I have to be completely honest here. On a first, surface-level read, without the systems engineering context, that verse sounds horrific.
It does.
It sounds like a pure, tyrannical decree of predestination. It sounds like a cosmic dictator stating, I could have made you all perfectly good, but I decided I need firewood for my cosmic torture chamber, so I am intentionally throwing a massive chunk of humanity into the flames on purpose.
That is the grim, fatalistic interpretation that so many people have internalized over the centuries. It paints the designer as malicious.
And Parwez tackles this fatalistic interpretation aggressively, right?
He detonates the predestination myth entirely. He argues that reading this verse as a malicious, arbitrary decree completely ignores the sociology, the linguistic context, and the systems design architecture we have been unpacking.
So how does he flip it?
He flips the traditional understanding entirely. This verse is not about preordaining failure. It is a profound architectural statement about the necessity of design choice.
Walk us through that architecture. How does a phrase like filling hell become a feature of design choice rather than a bug of cruelty?
It comes down to understanding the fundamental difference between a machine and a productive order. The text is stating an absolute architectural fact. Yes, the designer could have built a system where every single node, every human being, perfectly aligned with the rules automatically. The system could have been programmed so that humans had no capacity to choose anything other than the mathematically correct action 100% of the time.
Like the planetary system, the Earth doesn't wake up and choose to orbit the sun. Gravity compels it.
Right.
It cannot rebel.
Yeah.
It cannot decide to take a day off and drift into deep space. It's perfectly aligned, but it is entirely blind. It has no agency.
Exactly. But a system that compels alignment is not a productive civilization. It is merely a machine. Think of a beautifully crafted clock. It keeps perfect time. It never deviates, but it doesn't choose to keep perfect time.
It's just following gears.
Therefore, a clock cannot develop a personality. It cannot grow, it cannot learn, it cannot achieve self-actualization. For an operating system to produce the ultimate fruit, which is the actualized, self-aware, morally resilient human personality, the cootie, it must have the capacity for misalignment.
Because without the option to choose the wrong path, choosing the right path means absolutely nothing.
Exactly.
It's just an algorithm executing a pre-written script. If I program an AI to say, I love you, it hasn't developed empathy. It is just executing code.
Productive order requires the freedom of choice. And this is the crux of Parwez's argument. If you build a system with the genuine freedom of choice, you must, by definition, build a space for the consequences of the wrong choices to manifest.
That makes total sense.
The consequence of persistent misalignment, which the text metaphorically refers to as hell or a state of ruin, was built into the design purely because choice was built into the design.
So it's not a torture chamber built out of divine malice.
Not all.
It is the inevitable structural output of a specific type of data entry. It is the trash bin of the operating system. If you give users the ability to generate corrupted files, those files have to go somewhere. They have to resolve into a state of structural failure.
And Parwez makes it abundantly clear who ends up in this state of ruin. It is not arbitrary. It is not a random predestined lottery.
Who is it then?
He points out from the broader textual context that those who fill this state are those who deliberately, persistently refuse to use their intellect, their faculties of observation, their historical reasoning.
They ignore the data.
They choose to operate entirely below the level of their own hardware. They're given the capacity for high-level reason, but they choose to live entirely reactively, driven only by immediate physical desires and the accumulation of short-term power.
They are the executives eating the stolen ghee,
Yeah.
actively ignoring the fact that the bridge is vibrating under their feet.
Yes.
The system provides them with the math, but they choose to look the other way because the math threatens their immediate comfort.
They actively choose ignorance. And the system faithfully, mathematically, returns the output of that ignorance.
It really is an open source reality.
It is.
The system isn't maliciously trapping people. It has provided the manual. It has provided the internal sensors, intellect, observation, the historical precedent of collapsed empires. If you refuse to read the manual and you actively override all the safety protocols because you want to drive the vehicle faster and more recklessly,
Then a crash is inevitable.
a system crash isn't a punishment inflicted by an angry manufacturer. It is a feature of having manual control. You demanded the steering wheel. You cannot blame the manufacturer when you drive the car straight into a concrete wall.
That is the very essence of mukafat amal, the law of requital, the absolute unyielding return of action. You get exactly what you input.
The compounding feedback loop.
The system is perfectly just precisely because it is perfectly responsive. It does not intervene to save you from the consequences of your own freely chosen inputs.
This has been an incredibly intense, paradigm-shifting deconstruction of these verses. We've covered a massive amount of conceptual ground here.
We really have.
Let's pull back from the specific verses and synthesize this. How do we apply this massive systemic blueprint to the actual timeline of human history, and more importantly, to the daily reality of the person listening to this right now? What is the permanent rule and what are the variables?
The constant, the permanent, immutable principle that Parwez draws out of these verses is that the consequence cycle absolutely does not reset at death.
Right.
That is the foundational law of this operating system. The input is registered while the biological actor is active, but the output processes eternally. The ledger does not close just because the physical interface shuts down.
The passenger is off the train, the ticket is discarded, but the passenger still has to walk to their destination carrying every single piece of baggage they packed during the ride.
That is the permanent truth. The variable, the thing that changes across different eras, different centuries, and different technological epochs is the costume humanity puts on its denial.
The costume of denial.
Humans are infinitely creative at inventing new skins, new vocabulary, and new philosophical frameworks for the old death is escape fantasy.
Back in the ancient world, as verse 10 noted, it was literal, physical skepticism. My bones are turning to dust, therefore I am free. It was a primitive biological argument.
But today, the escape clauses we invent look much more sophisticated, much more polished, but underneath, they're the exact same mechanism.
The underlying psychology is identical.
Yes. Today, the escape hatch often looks like philosophical nihilism, the deeply cynical idea that nothing matters on a cosmic scale anyway. We are just dust on a rock floating in space, so morality is merely a social construct to be manipulated.
Or it looks like hypermaterialism, where the only measurable, verifiable reality is quarterly profits, shareholder value, and the immediate accumulation of capital.
It manifests as the modern YOLO mindset. You only live once.
Oh, that's a big one.
This philosophy aggressively promotes maximizing dopamine and immediate physical gratification at all costs, while intentionally blinding oneself to the collateral damage inflicted on others, because when it's over, it's over.
Let's look at one of the biggest ones in the modern era, corporate shielding.
Ah, yes.
The pursuit of temporal institutional power that actively outlasts personal accountability. Think about a board of directors making decisions that pollute a major river system with forever chemicals.
They know the science.
They know the cancer clusters won't statistically manifest in the local population for another 40 years. Because they hide behind a limited liability corporate veil, and because they know they will biologically pass away before the lawsuits ever reach a courtroom, they genuinely believe they have beaten the system.
They think they have successfully engineered a legal and biological escape hatch.
They extract the wealth now and let their biological death shield them from the consequence later.
And Parwez's reading of verses 10 through 13 acts as the ultimate impenetrable firewall against every single one of those modern escape clauses. The text categorically states, your philosophical nihilism, your complex corporate veils, your dopamine-driven YOLO philosophy, none of it alters the fundamental universal physics of the cootie.
It's all just smoke and mirrors.
Your personality, your core self, is still metabolizing the reality of those actions. The structural degradation of your cootie is still happening, whether you acknowledge the existence of the system or not. The universe's ledger does not recognize limited liability corporations. It recognizes the individual actor who made the choice.
That is a staggering weight to place on human action. If the system is this rigorous, this mathematically unyielding, and the friction of navigating the physical world is this intense, how does the passenger actually make it through intact?
It's a gauntlet.
How do we survive a system where every choice carries permanent weight?
This is where Parwez brings in one final, brilliantly evocative metaphor from Allama Iqbal to close out his analysis, and it perfectly illustrates how to navigate this friction. He compares the human self existing in the physical world to an oyster and a pearl in the ocean.
Set the scene for us. How does the ocean represent our daily reality?
The ocean is a place of perpetual chaos. There are violent storms, crushing pressures, crashing waves, predators, and constant abrasive movement. That ocean represents the physical world we live in.
It's the friction.
Exactly. It's the friction of our daily life, the economic struggles, the societal collapses, the interpersonal conflicts, the constant bombardment of choices. The oyster shell represents your physical body. It exists in the chaos, and it takes a severe beating.
Right, it gets scarred.
It gets scarred, it ages, it is subjected to the entropy of the angel of death, and eventually it will inevitably decay. But what happens inside the shell if the oyster is functioning correctly?
A grain of sand, an irritant from the chaotic ocean, gets inside. And the oyster responds to that friction by slowly, meticulously coating it. It takes the abrasive intrusion and transforms it.
By aligning your actions with universal constructive values, the Akhdar, the honest ghee we discussed earlier, the human self responds to the friction of the world by building something enduring. The crude becomes the pearl inside the shell.
It doesn't just survive, it transforms.
Notice that the pearl doesn't grow in spite of the friction. It grows precisely because of how it responds to the friction. It takes the turbulence, the suffering, and the challenges of the physical world and uses them to build density, beauty, and systemic permanence.
And then comes the moment of termination, the malak ul-mat.
When the biological shell finally breaks open when physical death occurs, the shell decays back into the ocean. It dissolves into the chaos. But the pearl remains.
It has fundamentally outlasted the biological mechanism that incubated it.
The ticket is punched and gone, but the passenger remains. The blossom withers and falls, but the fruit remains. The shell cracks and decays, but the pearl remains.
It's the exact same systemic truth repeating across different biological and physical metaphors.
Time and time again.
You can spend your entire life ignoring the system's rules. You can build the most elaborate philosophical, legal, and economic escape hatches imaginable to shield yourself from the consequences of your actions. But you cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring the rules.
The ledger simply does not close just because the biological actor leaves the stage.
It is a profoundly sobering realization.
But simultaneously, it's an incredibly empowering reality. It means that nihilism is false. It means every single action has weight. Every choice is an active event of creation.
In every moment, in every interaction, you are either painstakingly building the pearl or you are simply allowing yourself to dissolve into the storm.
Exactly.
We have mapped the system. We've looked at the consequence cycle, the inexorable mechanics of biological termination, the mathematics of the structural reckoning, and the persistent human illusion of the escape hatch.
We covered a lot of ground.
But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final mind-expanding thought. Something that takes Parwez's 1979 analytical framework and steps fully into the reality you are navigating right now, today, in the modern digital age.
I like where this is going.
Think about your daily life. Think about your data, your digital footprint, the code you write, the algorithms you help train with your behavior, the institutions you participate in building or dismantling.
It's all recorded.
We already know, as a factual reality of modern technology, that these digital inputs will outlast your physical body by decades, perhaps even centuries. A cruel statement published online, a viral video that shifts public opinion, a piece of malicious software, or conversely, a beautifully coded open-source tool that helps millions. The inputs you create today continue to trigger real-world consequences.
They ripple out forever.
They generate reactions, they alter lives, and they cascade through networks long after you log off, long after your physical hardware has shut down and returned to the earth. If human beings, with our deeply flawed, limited, rudimentary technology, have already managed to organically create a system where your inputs continue to process and echo through a network long after you are gone, how unscientific is it, really, to assume that the universe itself, the ultimate operating system, doesn't have an even more sophisticated, infinitely more precise cloud backup for the human soul?
That is the question.
If we, in our infancy, can build a ledger that doesn't forget, why are we so arrogantly certain the cosmos hasn't already perfected one? Think about the compounding interest of your inputs the next time you assume nobody's watching. We will leave you there.